See, I just want to talk about this thing of maximizing grace. You know, I remember as a young believer that people would often say to each other something like, that's because you're doing it in your own strength. But unfortunately, it seemed like people could recognize when someone was trying to do something in their own strength because they sort of knew what it looked like. But nobody ever seemed to define it, let alone tell you how to avoid it. And so you're in this thing where it's kind of like, well, that doesn't work because you're doing it in your own strength. Okay. Now what? And I suspect that was mostly down to the sort of prevailing culture, both inside and outside of the church. It's why there's statements like, God helps those who help themselves, are so common. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of religion that it always starts with you and not God. See, in this way of thinking, not only do you become conditioned to believe that God helps those who help themselves, but you also believe that you have to do everything that you can do before you trust God with the bit that you can't do. In other words, the sequence is do first, trust second. And the problem with that is it's almost impossible to trust when you go down that path. And the reason that is because when you practice that, you find yourself constantly analyzing, have I done everything I should have done? Is there still more that I need to do? What extra do I need to add? And then you feel like, well, obviously I haven't done enough because it hasn't worked. I mean, I'm sure you've all had those conversations with someone where you've needed a breakthrough, you've needed a solution, and they've presented you with a checklist. Well, did you pray about it? Did you fast? Did you get wise counsel? Did you give money? Did you, whatever the list is. But Father, Son, and Holy Spirit don't help those who help themselves. They help those who acknowledge that they can't help themselves. That's the message of the gospel, that God helps us because we're helpless. You see, instead of do, then trust, the order actually is trust and then maybe do afterwards. Trust is one of the core components of being childlike. I mean, kids think that adults, especially mom and dad, know everything and can do anything. That they live in trust and they just don't worry about any of it. Don't worry about any of it. But we are being culturally conditioned not to trust. In fact, trusting is for naive people. And certainly trusting everyone all of the time is not wise. But that posture of never trusting bleeds over into our relationship with God. You see, and what happens is that most people want knowledge, or preferably even clarity, before they trust. It's like this scenario in the Gospel of John during the Last Supper, John chapter 13, 1-8. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and, taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said, "You shall never wash my feet." Peter doesn't understand, so he doesn't cooperate. I think many times people limit their cooperation or their obedience to the limit of their understanding. But Father, Son, and Holy Spirit always are inviting us to trust them with what we don't understand. I suspect that nearly all our testimonies that we were just talking about required a step of faith, a step of risk, a step where we didn't have all of the answers and didn't know all of the outcomes before we started. We had to take risk. We had to be willing to be uncomfortable. We had to walk by faith and not by sight. There's a great moment in one of the episodes of The Chosen when Jesus and the disciples are setting out on the trip. I think it's the one where they're going to cutting through Samaria. And the disciples start questioning Jesus and how he's going about things. And he turns around to them and he says, "Listen, if we're going to have a question and answer session every time we do something you're not used to, it's going to be a very annoying time together for all of us." And having led a few trips, there's a few times I've wanted to say something pretty similar to that myself. Because we like to have lots and lots of information. Somehow we think that's going to make us more comfortable. But let me connect the dots here. We're operating in our own strength when we start by doing and not by trusting. We're operating in our own strength when we start without receiving first. We're operating in our own strength when we try to perform, earn, or impress God in order to receive. We're operating in our own strength when we choose independence over dependence and self-sufficiency over reliance on Him. We're operating in our own strength when we trust in formulas instead of the leading of the Holy Spirit. We're operating in our own strength when we stay inside our comfort zones and avoid taking risks or demand clarity before trusting. Maximizing grace starts by admitting need, admitting weakness, and embracing dependence. Joel 3, verse 10 says, "Let the weak say, I am strong." That's the King James version and the one that most of us have sung. Let the weak say I am strong. But actually the language is stronger than that. Several translations don't say weak, they say weakling. And they don't say strong, they say I'm a soldier, I'm a warrior, I'm a mighty man. So let the weakling say I'm a warrior. That's great news, but only if we're willing to acknowledge our weakness first. I think in some church settings, we're trained to bypass the starting point and skip over it to the end point. And I don't think that works. I don't think it works. The verse doesn't say, just deny that you're weak and you'll be strong. Pretend that you're strong. It doesn't say any of that. It's admitting that you're weak first, and from that place of weakness, confessing that I am strong, that I am a warrior, because I'm now going to receive strength from God to be different than how I am left to my own devices. The Apostle Paul famously wrote in 2 Corinthians 12, 7-10, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." See, weakness is not the doorway to defeat and becoming a softie. Weakness is the doorway to victory and courage. Grace doesn't come to us as we fake it till we make it. Grace comes to us when we admit our weakness and admit our need. So if we want grace to abound to us, we have to embrace our weakness and our limitations. Graham Cook talks about turning a weakness into a joyful vulnerability. A place where you meet with God because you know you need him in that space. Because from there, then we can begin to live in dependence and trust and ask for help. And that's the life that Jesus modeled. It's the life that Jesus modeled. This is so countercultural to us in every setting and in every culture. The kingdom is just different from everything else. I love this quote from Jonathan Martin in the book Prototype. We've always been inclined to worship people or things we perceive as being great. So we exaggerate our own greatness, inflate our successes, downplay our weaknesses, and hide our scars. Thus, human history is largely the story of people who say, my God can beat up your God. My king can beat up your king. My army is more awesome than your army. And then attempt to prove the point to each other, all in the name of greatness. In ancient cultures, people often tried to appeal to the extraordinary power and dominance of their gods as reasons for worship. Pharaohs, Caesars, emperors, and even many of our contemporary celebrities are humans whose feats of power and achievement make people worship them as virtual gods. So what do we make of a God who is worshipped not for his might, but for his weakness, even for his wounds? Not a human wearing the medals of military conquest to convince us he is a God, but a God who wears his suffering on his sleeve to convince us he is human. Instead of my God can beat up your God, my king can beat up your king, Jesus' path to kingship comes wrapped in a very odd strategy indeed. He is the King of Kings largely because he lets himself get beat up. He is victorious not despite his scars, but because of them. This is exactly what we are offered in Jesus, the God who was completely human, the one who demonstrated that he is the ultimate king by allowing himself to be bullied. You see, when it comes to us, beloved, Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 4:7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. He doesn't need our strength to make him look good. In fact, he particularly likes to use our weaknesses and our ordinariness to exhibit his glory and his grace. Now, because people often misunderstand, let me say this. I'm not suggesting that we're always meant to be passive. People often misunderstand the relationship between grace and works. We do not do works to earn our salvation. We do works as evidence of our salvation. The issue is not the doing. The issue is the motivation for doing. There's a quote from Dallas Willard who says, grace is opposed to earning, which is an attitude, not effort, which is an action. Grace is opposed to earning, which is an attitude, not effort, which is an action. You see, grace enables us to do. In 1 Corinthians 15:10, Paul writes, but by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was with me. See, grace doesn't mean we do nothing. It might mean that we do a lot. But grace means we don't start with doing, and we don't do in order to earn. Grace, by its very nature, must first be received before we do anything. The default setting of the mind of Christ is, Father, what do you think about that? It's hardwired to operate in response to his guidance and his grace. Because Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing, only said what he heard the Father saying. So that's his default posture as always. What do you think about it, Dad? That comes before anything else. So if he says, do this, then we do it. But if he says, leave it to me, then we leave it to him. And it's just as easy, especially in certain relationships, for us to do too much as it is for us to do too little. Let's just be honest about that. The issue isn't doing something versus doing nothing. The issue is operating in trust, not in worry. And that looks different in different situations. So just before I wrap up, just take a couple of minutes right now and just say, Father, where do you want me to relate differently to my weaknesses so that I can receive your strength and your grace? Where do you want me to relate differently to my weaknesses so that I can receive your strength and your grace?